Hey, everybody. Welcome to The Thoughtful Bro. We're here for another amazing, exciting Tuesday at 2 o'clock to talk about what makes great books tick and what makes great authors tick. We are live streaming as usual on Facebook and YouTube. A few words before we get to our great guest today and his fantastic, unique, uncategorizable book. A Mighty Blaze is an all-volunteer initiative to help writers reach readers virtually during COVID and beyond. You can find all our interviews on the Mighty Blaze Facebook page and YouTube pages. At A Mighty Blaze, we're not asking for any money. You can support us by liking us and following us on all our socials, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. If you're new, just do us a favor, give us a like, give us a follow. That would be great. You can also support A Mighty Blaze, if you'd like, by subscribing to our weekly author interview podcast. You can find that anywhere podcasts are downloaded. To find out more about A Mighty Blaze, you can go to amightyblaze.com, and there you can also sign up for our weekly newsletter. And in your inbox every Sunday will be a list of all of our upcoming author interviews. We have about 6 or 7 different hosts throughout the week talking to all different kinds of authors, mostly about books that are pubbing right now. So it's very fresh always on the Blaze. If you are, in fact, in the mood to spend money, here's what I'd recommend. Spend it on books that shine a light on the fragile state of our environment and the rare, strange, and vulnerable creatures which inhabit our Earth alongside us. Books like The Devil's Hole Pupfish by Kevin Brown. We will have time for audience questions at the end. Whether you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, please post them in the comments. I'm thrilled to say also that next Tuesday on September 21st, I will have on Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman. He was the key witness in the first Trump impeachment trial, and following his Senate testimony, Vindman was subject to intense backlash by the Trump administration and forced into early retirement, but that has not kept him quiet, thank goodness. His memoir is called Here, Right Matters, An American Story. So I will be deeply honored and excited to have Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman on a week from today. But now, on to this week. Kevin Brown is a research associate in the University of California, Santa Barbara's Environmental Studies program. He has worked as a journalist and researcher for the National Park Service and the American Society for Environmental History. Anita Guerini of Oregon State University had this to say about Devil's Hole Pupfish, his book. You have probably never heard of the Devil's Hole Pupfish. In his fine and widely ranging book, Kevin Brown reveals that this 1-inch long, twitchy blue fish is a microcosm of the contentious histories of wilderness, science, water, and policy in the modern American West. This tiny fish contains multitudes. Kevin, we're so happy to have you here. Thanks for coming on The Thoughtful Bro.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. Thanks for having me, Mark.
So this is great. So I have to say, I read this book over the weekend and I was inspired by it. Inspired is the word. And I love being inspired. It's frankly one of the main reasons I go to books at all, is to be inspired and invigorated about life. And when you start hearing about the Devil's Hole Pupfish, you see that it lives in this ultra extreme habitat. It's basically a contradiction in terms. This is a desert fish, if that makes sense to anybody. It's living in this underwater cavern with about 100 of its fellow species. It's the only place on Earth that these fish live. These earthquakes come and they like shake the underwater cavern, and they make these mini tsunamis, and like waves jump up like 10 feet in the air. It is the smallest habitat of any vertebrate species, I think, in the world. And so what I want to say, Kevin, is as I was reading this book, I was like, if the Devil's Hole Pupfish can wake up today and get it done, I can get it done too. Do you feel that way? Do you feel inspired when you think about the fish?
Yeah, I mean, one of the central ways I wanted to talk about the pupfish, or one of the questions I had been, like, okay, this fish is really rare, it lives in this really extreme habitat. One of the, it's an endangered species, so people are often worried about it. And then I woke up one morning and was like, wait, how has it made it this far? And is this a story about persistence? And I think in some ways it's amazing and lucky that it has persisted when many of its close relatives geographically and genetically have not.
Right. So folks, in this interview, we're going to go about 40 more minutes. Please put your questions in the chat. This is an amazing story. Kevin is an expert on the Devil's Hole Pupfish, so please ask him any question you want. But we're going to get into the entire history of where this fish lives, how it has survived, the intense controversy around the conservation efforts. So it's just a fascinating story. But I have to say, Kevin, overall, I don't know how Pixar isn't calling you right now. I mean, this has all the elements of a Pixar film. It has an adorable underdog main character. It's got big corporate bad guys. It's got good guys. There's something called the Pupfish Task Force. It's the fish itself, and we'll get into this, is sort of this charismatic, cute blue little fish. I guess I just think, do you see the cinematic qualities here the way I do?
Maybe it's true they have not called yet, but I do think, we have this idea about what is charismatic as being like, oh, it's a lion or a bear. We have these charismatic wildlife species, and during the time that I've been researching the pupfish, I've come to think that this little fish, which you wouldn't automatically think is charismatic, has come to embody those kinds of things we associate with other kinds of wildlife. Like people care about it. They want to have a stuffed animal that's a pupfish, and which exists, and have it on their hat and see it as a mascot, maybe for an ecosystem. Right. I was thinking I would buy a T-shirt that said "Be the pupfish." I just like, get out there today, be the pupfish. It's an inspiring little guy. So I'm going to get into a little bit more about the characteristics of him later, of him and her. But let's just talk for a moment. Let's go way back to the beginning, because folks, even sort of every aspect of this story is interesting in its own way. But to start at the very beginning, the origins of the Devil's Hole pupfish and how it got into the Devil's Hole to begin with, which is, like I said, an underground 60-foot by 10-foot hole in the desert. How it got there is a big question. And there's a lot of theories about how it originally got there. Some people think it's been there 60,000 years. And, the Death Valley used to be covered in water. So maybe it's a leftover. Maybe there was an extreme flooding event. Other people say it's maybe only even been there a few hundred years, and Native Americans might have put it there on purpose, or a bird might have accidentally dropped a few in there. Kevin, what is your thought on how these miraculous fish got to the middle of the desert? Yeah, so Devil's Hole is this opening into a vast aquifer, basically in southern Nevada, right on the border.
Before you go on, Kevin, explain what an aquifer is.
Yeah, so an aquifer is an underground waterlogged formation. And this particular one creates kind of tubes. And so 60,000 years ago, the roof of an underground cavern opened and exposed Devil's Hole. So it's this narrow opening into this really deep aquifer. And 2 divers have drowned in Devil's Hole, and no trace of them has ever been found. So we know it's quite deep. And so the question is, well, how did the fish get here? And what we know about them is that they would not be likely to have traveled underground to get there. They had to get there at the surface. We also know that the water level in the desert, we know it's fluctuated a lot, but it seems like it hasn't actually reached the lip of Devil's Hole. So it didn't get in that way. And so there's been a lot of speculation about how this could have happened. One biologist said, we know exactly how pupfish migrated over millions of years through the Caribbean, through inland seas, but we don't know how it got the last 2 kilometers. And so some researchers have thought, well, if we study its genetics, we can tease apart how long ago it separated from its closest genetic relatives. But the techniques for that are very difficult, and there are 2 theories about that. And one puts it at maybe it was 60,000 years ago, right when the cavern opened, some kind of cataclysmic event that let the fish in, right as the cavern opened. And then another group says, actually, we think it's quite recent, within the last few hundred years. And so that actually is, even that may seem kind of arcane or trivial, but it actually has a lot to do with how we could then help the pupfish. The pupfish have been in there for 60,000 years. They may be genetically pretty bulletproof, but conservation biologists worry a lot about small populations like the pupfish are. And if they've only been in there for a couple hundred years, then they may be undergoing some genetic changes which could lead to their extinction. And so there needs to be a lot more research done on that, but how we answer it could really affect what we choose to do with the pupfish in the future, how we choose to manage them.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. And it's just fascinating that with all the powers of science that we have and all the eyes that are on this, we still don't know the answer. It's just this great mystery. I love that at the center of this is this profound mystery of how did these little tiny fish get here? Let's talk about Devil's Hole itself, which is another, like every detail in this story, fantastic detail. It's in the middle. It's about 90 miles west of Las Vegas. It's part of Death Valley National Park. You mentioned that 2 people had died diving in it, but the amount of divers in it is extremely small. I think I heard somewhere that the amount of people who have dove in that pool, like with scuba tanks and all that, is fewer people than have walked on the moon. It's extremely rare to go down in Devil's Hole. It's obviously very well protected now. There's fencing all around it, so nobody can get there. But it's, again, the opening is 10 feet by 60 feet. It's always 93 degrees in there. What a strange place. I guess my question to put to you is, in all the time you spent there thinking about it, what do you think is the most remarkable feature maybe of Devil's Hole?
Yeah, I think that I really like the idea that in a desert, we have water. And so I think being able to you stand on a visitor's platform. If anyone goes there, you walk up to a visitor platform, and the hole itself is actually about 40 feet kind of right down from you. You're looking down into this tiny opening, and you actually are staring into this aquifer, into a waterlogged formation under the earth that connects miles and tens of miles across. So I think that in and of itself it's a very rare thing to be able to see. And I think visualizing that is really compelling. The water in the West creates invisible connections, I guess, is the thing to say about that. Ed Abbey, the Western writer, once sort of darkly speculated that someday the bones or the equipment of these 2 divers who drowned would pop out at Furnace Creek Springs, which is 40 or 50 miles away in Death Valley. And so that's kind of hyperbole, but I think being able to kind of visualize the water itself in the earth is kind of a wild thing. There are a number of other springs right around Devil's Hole. It's part of a group called Ash Meadows, and if you visit, you can get actually much closer to some of the other springs and water features, and they are truly remarkable, because as you're driving there, you're thinking, how could there ever be any water out here? And then you show up and there are springs discharging at a few thousand gallons a minute. Wow,
amazing. And just to be clear, can you explain, if it's possible to do this briefly, why is there a bunch of water under the desert?
Yeah, so if you go to Las Vegas, the mountains that you see, sometimes snow-capped to the west, are the Spring Mountains, and water falling in the Spring Mountains infiltrates soil and rock, and eventually flows kind of in a little horseshoe pattern north and then back south through to Ash Meadows underground over time scales of thousands of years.
Right.
And then there's a fault system that runs through Ash Meadows, and that creates this kind of this discontinuity. It pushes water to the surface.
Right.
Okay. My training is as an environmental historian, and so I'm trained in the humanities and how to think about how people relate to these scientific processes, the way scientists think. So one of the things we do is try and understand how the knowledge of that story, like how did people figure out that water went in this pattern? How does that affect our relationship to a species like the pupfish or to water rights or something like that?
No, it's really part of the story. I mean, I think, again, as somebody, you're talking to somebody who certainly kind of broadly cares about the environment and broadly thinks that global warming is a very bad and dangerous thing. But I am, in every sense, a layperson. And so I'm sort of a great kind of target audience for a story like this. And I have to say that if I truly understood, I mean, some of this information nobody understands, but if I truly understood, how did the water get there? How did the fish get there? All of the story of the fish itself creates an emotional reaction in a person and makes people, in other words, care about it. And so I agree with you that even that thing of how can there be water under the desert is part of the ultimate game that you're trying to win, which is how do I make people care about this strange species?
Yeah, I write in the intro to the book, I say, like, if you've never heard of the pupfish, don't worry. It's okay. Don't panic. The pupfish have been involved in a number of really important institutions that, so they're involved in a bunch of different scientific processes, right? Like how does water move around the desert?
Right.
But then in the 20th century, they're also connected to these really particular sets of rules and ideas that have come to mean a lot across the West and across the country. So, like, how do we decide who gets to use water?
Right.
It's a big issue. How do we decide what to protect?
Right.
And so the pupfish really fits right in there. And so hopefully, a reader can connect to this longer timescale story about water in the desert. How did the pupfish get there? But then also to the more recent institutions that have shaped where the pupfish lives and how they survive.
And before we move on from Devil's Hole, I just want to say to everybody, I would recommend just go on YouTube at some point and just plug in Devil's Hole pupfish, and you will see some video of this underwater cavern, which, as Kevin alluded to, nobody knows how deep this aquifer is. So I think people have dove down to 400 plus feet, but that by no means is the bottom. And it's like another mysterious aspect of this thing where the walls of this aquifer, once you start looking at the visuals, they look like white pillows. That's this kind of strange mineral formations. Anyway, it's just completely beautiful. So I would just say to anybody, just look at some video of this habitat of the Devil's Hole pupfish and you'll be amazed. But let's move on to the pupfish itself, which is that, so a few things to remark here, Kevin. So one is, and this may seem crass, but I can't help but feel that the name of the Devil's Hole pupfish, before we even get to its qualities from an environmental perspective and its charisma as a species, let's just talk about the name. I was thinking to myself, like, if somebody had written a book called, the Atlantic red-finned cod or something, right? Just to make up a name of a fish. I'd be like, oh, that's too bad that the Atlantic red-finned cod is going to die. But then you tell me the Devil's Hole pupfish. I'm like, tell me more. I mean, it's, and I got to thinking, I was sort of joking with you in the green room, like, wouldn't it be great if every endangered species got some marketing company to come up with a new name for it that would make people like really care about it? And it does sound crass, and I know that, but would you agree that, this kind of curious, funny, unusual name for this fish sort of has something to do with its notoriety?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're not wrong that naming is really important, and that's like the first chapter is titled "What's in a Name?"
Right.
So there's two parts to the name, right? So Devil's Hole. There are devils something all over the West and all over the country. You can all over the world, and I think it's at least in Nevada and Utah. I don't know the specific person who gave it that name, but it was in use by the 1890s. And Euro-American settlers often sort of brought this kind of fear of the wilderness with them as they settled across the country. And so oddities often got called something bad. And so
Right.
Devil's Hole is definitely, there are a number of Devil's Holes out there. And then pupfish comes from one of the first scientists who studied them, thought that the fish kind of moved around a little like puppies. They chase each other. So there is Devil's Hole and pupfish kind of coming together.
Right.
Yeah, and so I think that to your question though, like, well, does this contribute to its survival? I think it definitely contributes to it being kind of a charismatic species by having a kind of funky name.
Right. And so let's get into that. This is something that many people say about the pupfish, that it is charismatic. You describe it that way. You also call it a survivor. Clearly, it is that. But if, like, let's say Pixar calls you right after this interview and they say, hey, we want to make this movie. forget Finding Nemo. And they said, can you just give us a few character notes on the Devil's Hole pupfish? What kind of fish will this be? How would you characterize this fish?
Yeah, so the pupfish, when you see them, they're about an inch long. They're little. The males are very deep blue, and they do sort of appear to sometimes kind of guard a little area and chase other males away. They tend to hang out near the top of the water column in Devil's Hole, and in comparison to their other pupfish out there in the West, other species. What makes the Devil's Hole pupfish unique, if you actually had one under a microscope, the first thing a biologist would look at is whether the fish has pelvic fins, which are these little fins on the bottom of the fish. And Devil's Hole pupfish do not have pelvic fins. So when scientists started looking at the pupfish, that was one of the first things that they noticed that made it unique. Mm-hmm. And that uniqueness is what has served to justify its addition to the national park system and its addition to the endangered species list, both of which have played a major role in its persistence.
Right. So the fish right now is critically endangered, correct? That's the official term. That is like the most endangered you can be before going extinct. Is that right?
Yeah, I believe that critically endangered is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature uses that term. They're in the U.S. though. They're on the endangered species list. So that's the legal sort of protection that they receive by virtue of having a small population.
And let's talk for a moment about that population in numbers. And there's twice a year at Devil's Hole, the scientists do a fish count, and they count how many are there. And that number has gotten as low as around 40. And I think some of the higher numbers I saw were in the hundreds. But can you give me the range? Because there's probably also an upper limit, right? There's only so many fish that could theoretically live there. What is the kind of fluctuating range of the number?
So the range of the population is really interesting. So they've observed, first of all, they observe a seasonal variation. So basically in the summer, when there's sunlight hitting Devil's Hole, the population starts to pick up. And so when they count them in the fall, there's a high count for the year, typically. And then over the winter, no sunlight actually hits Devil's Hole because of the angle of the sun. And the population and food resources are so scarce that the population kind of crashes. Right. And so you have this seasonal variation. So in the spring, you're going to have a lower population in the fall. So the low populations that have been recorded under 40 have all been in the spring. And the high populations have been recorded as high as in the mid 500s, but that wouldn't be in the same year. So the main issue that after they began counting pupfish in the 1970s, the Park Service, it was in the middle of a crisis that we can talk about with the landowner using a bunch of groundwater resources in the area. But after that case was settled and water began rising in the hole, the population peaked in 1995. That mid 500s figure comes from the mid 90s. But since then, and they don't really know why, there's been this decline. And so in 2006 and 2013 is when, they were getting spring counts of under 40.
Got it. And what do you think the population is right now?
Yeah, so there's been a hiatus in counting during the pandemic, but the most recent publicly available count from the fall of 2019 placed the population just under 200.
Got it. Okay, so sort of in the middle.
Yeah, so it can, the one way to think about the population is basically with 200 fish, you could fit the whole population in a gallon milk jug.
Gosh.
So.
Oh my gosh. So, living up to its billing as the rarest fish on Earth, certainly by volume anyway, if not by number. But so let's talk about, and by the way, before I go on, just want to say to anybody in the audience, please ask any questions, pop them in the chat. They'll make their way to me and Kevin. But the conservation fight here is very interesting, and it's very dramatic. It involves a Supreme Court decision about protecting the rights of the pupfish. It involves groundwater pumping, which is, I mean, in the southwestern portion of the United States, especially around Los Angeles, moving water from one place to another is a kind of Herculean task that involves all these resources. Water is very precious out there. So one frankly can understand that, you know, getting water from underground in the desert would be something that people would want and try to access. As I mentioned earlier, there's the pupfish task force. There were bumper stickers that said save the pupfish, then other bumper stickers that said kill the pupfish. It's been very, very dramatic. But one line that really jumped out at me in the book was you said, the pupfish have survived by becoming cosmopolitan. They are tied up in our own institutions. And I think basically the story of the pupfish has stopped in some ways becoming a nature story and started becoming an institutional, legal kind of courtroom story. Is that fair?
I mean, yes. Although what's interesting about how water law and natural resource law works generally is that the specifics of the environment remain central to how these cases are resolved. And so in the case of Devil's Hole pupfish, the battle at the Supreme Court was whether or not a private rancher could pump groundwater that would result in the lowering of the water level in Devil's Hole to the extent that it would cause its extinction, or whether the Park Service, which had already reserved that area, could claim that that water is necessary for the preservation of the fish. So it was really about who was there first. Right. And so the resolution to the case, even though it becomes about principles of federal water rights, about who has the authority to use this water, it's also about, well, how much water does it take for a pupfish to survive? And how much water needs to be in this hole? And then if you come to that result, then how much groundwater pumping can be done within, upwards of 20 or 25 miles from Devil's Hole. So it becomes a very much a legal fight, but it remains connected to the weird specifics of the hole itself and of the pupfish as a species.
And it becomes extremely complicated because of the way that the water moves under different properties, right? It's not like a lake where a lake is just there and it's on, you can know what the area of the lake is and the lake has a bottom like a bowl. This is something that's like almost like the air we breathe. It's something that moves above and, in this case, below the land across different people's properties. So if you suck it out 30 miles away, it's going to suck it out from under somebody else's property, right?
Yeah. And so the way that water law works in Nevada is that the state owns the water. So the people in Nevada own the water, groundwater resources. But you can get the right from the state as a private individual to take some of that water.
Got it.
And so you don't own the water that's underneath your property at any moment, but you can apply for the right to use some of it as it kind of passes by you, sure, if you want to think about it that way.
Yeah, amazing. So let's talk about some of the problems with conservation. I mean, clearly we spent the last 30 minutes talking about how wonderful the pupfish is and how quirky and charismatic and rare it is. And certainly it is all those things. But you can't address this story without talking about the other side of the issue, which is, for example, as I think one Nevada newspaper said, something, it had a headline to the effect of, how much resources can we devote to saving these, say, 200 fish that can fit inside of a gallon of milk? And I think it's a really legitimate question. And there at some point, one can easily imagine crossing that boundary if there is, for example, like, for whatever reason, water, and certainly with global warming, this is possible that there will be water shortages throughout the West and people will need water to live. And you can imagine the argument starting to break down in certain scenarios. So I guess this is maybe even a philosophical question because it's not tied to a specific acute situation right now, but how do you address that philosophical question of what is the right amount of resources to put towards saving this one species, especially in the light of there are also other endangered species in the world as well?
Yeah. So this question goes back to the earliest days of the Endangered Species Act and its predecessor acts. At one point there in the late 60s, a Fish and Wildlife Service employee wrote a memo saying, how can we justify using all these resources for this one pupfish species when we have 80 other species on the endangered species list? That's just in the US. And
Right.
today we have over 1,600 species on the endangered species list. So there's no definitive answer that I can give you, but one of the things I've sort of observed is really two things. First, settling these questions of water allocation are not great forums to settle distributional questions about income in this country. So, for example, there were people laid off as a result of not being able in the 1970s, not being able to use water for ranching. But that doesn't really answer the question about whether how should those people be supported or find another meaningful occupation. So natural resource law is really bad with addressing questions of distribution. And then the second is I've observed that a number of the groups that have said, well, how can we spend this money on the pupfish, or how can we put pupfish over people, have done so rather disingenuously to advance a particular interest as a land developer or speculator. And so it's not clear to me that that those claims are any more honest than they seem, I guess.
Sure. I can imagine. One other very interesting aspect of the work, and I think in the final questions I want to ask you are just sort of about a broader way that your book can be read by other people interested in conservation and the environment, and maybe applying some of what they learn in this book to other situations. But one of the things that I thought was so interesting was this way that even when we humans are trying to help this fish, we sometimes do it the wrong way, or there are unintended consequences. I mean, you bring up in the book that these fish eat algae, and the algae is created by light. And so humans were trying to create more algae. So we started shining some light on it, but it was the wrong kind of light, and it made the wrong kind of algae. And so here, even with our best intentions, it's, to say the least, a learning experience. I just wanted to ask you about that aspect of it. I think you kind of cheekily described in the book as the fish have even survived our own attempts to save it.
Yeah. That was one of my favorite parts to write about, because I'm, personally sympathetic to, and reading the papers, reading these archival documents, memos from these biologists. I became very sympathetic to their efforts. They want to save this fish, but it's a great reminder that we don't always know how to do that. That the methods and tools that we have at our disposal are not always. It's not always obvious how to employ them. And I think in addition to the technical part, like, well, how do we save this fish? There's also the issue of how do we organize ourselves as people in order to enable us to have the best shot at protecting this fish. And one of the things I wrote about is how the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Park Service, the Nevada Department of Wildlife didn't always know how to organize themselves in the best way possible to maintain the pupfish. And so there's the technical question, like, how do we do this? And then there's a social question of how do we put ourselves in the best position to be able to do this work.
Right. Fascinating. So it's so complicated, really. It's one of it's the reason why there is a book about this, right? Because in some ways it's so simple: save the pupfish. And then as soon as you start digging down, there's so many unanswered questions, so much complexity. And also, I think it's sort of humbling, and on the note of what you were just talking about in human efforts to try to help, but being somewhat unable to help for a variety of reasons. It's humbling to humans to kind of see in many ways it is sort of out of our control. And like there's even with whatever efforts we make, there's sort of so many factors that are involved in this that it's difficult to really think that we have it under control. But one other question I wanted to ask you about the conservation efforts is, do you feel that there are things, kind of general principles from the story of the pupfish that other people interested in being conservationists can learn for their own efforts?
Yeah, and I finished the book by writing a little bit about this. The pupfish is weird, right? It's this particular story. It does connect to these bigger issues, but if you look too closely at it, you're going to say, how could I apply any of this knowledge? And one of the things that I took away ultimately is that what makes the pupfish different from other species that have gone extinct is that there have been a long line of people, both government employees, watchdogs, independent scientists, university scientists, who have had their eyes on the pupfish over maybe about the last 130 years. And so what enables conservation of a place, of a species, of a region, I think depends on how careful we are at looking at it, how many sets of eyeballs we have trained on the place. And the pupfish, Devil's Hole is not a big place, and there have been a lot of people looking at it, and I think that has made the difference.
And to bring it back to what we're up to here on the Blaze and what we believe deep down in our souls, all 30 of us who work for the Blaze, I think all of us believe to a certain extent that storytelling is life-changing. And in this case, that is literally true for these pupfish. I think the quality, as we've seen in this discussion, the quality of the story, the origins of the story, the character of the fish, the character of the different people who are involved, which you get into some in your story, the different characters around this story, all of these things, people have an emotional response to a story, and the way that the story is told and who is telling it can just make all the difference. And so, again, I'm kind of boiling this down for a self-serving end, but in some sense, it's true that it all comes down to the quality of the storytelling.
Yeah, I think that, in the 50s, I totally agree. And in the 50s, in this particular case, the Park Service was like, we don't want to tell anyone about the pupfish. Like, people might show up and look at them, and we don't know how to deal with that. But pretty quickly, by the 60s, biologists, government employees, anyone who cared about them realized that this fish is going to live or die based on how many people are paying attention. Yep. And I think that that's true in a lot of conservation issues, and also, of course, in social issues as well.
Right. Okay, so we have time for a couple audience questions. If our producer could pop them up, if she gets a moment. Audience Q, could pupfish be raised in an artificial habitat? That is an interesting question, and I'll let you take it away. It's an interesting question.
Yeah. So currently, they're about 2 miles away from Devil's Hole. There is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service operates a refuge for the Devil's Hole pupfish, and the building itself that contains this has a 100,000 gallon sort of replica of Devil's Hole. It's pretty intense operation, and the goal with that is to create a backup population of Devil's Hole pupfish. They've been partly successful in that effort, but for a long time, the answer to that question was no. People had attempted to raise pupfish in aquaria, in various kind of other outdoor tanks, and for limited periods of time, they've been successful, but those had all failed by about 2003. And so this new effort that began operating in 2013 has attempted to do that. But it's still a challenge for the refuge manager there.
And just without going too far afield, but as briefly as you can, why is it that you can't just raise these in captivity in an aquarium?
In some ways, that's $1 million question. the idea is, at least the assumption is, that they have very specific requirements for actually having a successful egg. Though they've raised them in tanks and observed spawning behavior, but none of those eggs reached maturity, that sort of thing. And so the effort that's ongoing now, they actually use they harvest eggs from Devil's Hole in little mats of carpet, and then they bring them into the facility and coax them into this backup habitat.
Wow. Okay, let's get another audience question if we have one. Hold on, I'm getting the hold please signal. Okay, from Margit. Hi. The book sounds so great. How much there is your imagination in it? Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, as a historian, like in journalism, where we're tied to the sources that we have, the archival documents, the interviews we do, all those sort of things. But once you assemble all that information, you start to have to think about, what does it all mean, and how does it fit together? And I think probably many historians would be a little skittish about using imagination, but I do think there's a big creative part to it. It's not the same process as writing a novel or anything, but it does require kind of saying, well, how do these things all fit together, and telling that, and that's actually what the book itself is, right? It's an explanation of how I think all these things fit together, and we use sources and we document it, but it does require the interpretation of the writer.
Yeah. Okay, one more, and then I'll move on to my final question. If we wanted to help the pupfish, what could we do?
Oh, that's interesting. I think that one thing to do is to visit and see the place where they live, and kind of, if it's possible anyway, if you live in the West, come check out Ash Meadows and Devil's Hole. And if you're further afield, I think that it's also useful to look at what's in your own backyard, and that you could help. And in some ways, that's a starting point for maybe building connections to the pupfish from far away.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Kevin. Listen, I have one more question for you before we wrap here. This has been terrific. I guess it's a two-part question. So the first part of the question is this: if the pupfish, Devil's Hole pupfish, did go extinct, can you just tell me what that would mean to you, and what do you think that would mean to kind of all of us?
Yeah. So I wrote the book is about how this fish has survived, and so I started also to have to think about what would it mean if it became extinct. And I think on the one hand, it would be really sad to lose a piece of biodiversity and know that human intervention had played a part in that happening. But I think it would also be worth looking at the story of the pupfish, especially over the last 130, 140 years, to understand why that extinction would take place in 2021 as opposed to in 1970 or 1930, or any of these moments in the past when people were worried about the fish going extinct. So in other words, the way that it has made it this far would be as important to reflect on as the extinction itself.
Right. And the second part of my question is, if your book, what in your wildest dreams, imagine this book is received in just the way you want it to be received, what effect would you like it to have on the world?
Oh man, that's a great one. Also a really tough one, Mark. I hope that it would make people think about their relationship to the environment that's around them. And I mentioned earlier that I really came to see the lesson of the pupfish as it had a lot of people paying attention to it, and that's one of the reasons it's made it this far. Well, there are a lot of other species and places that deserve that kind of attention. And so if people look at the pupfish and see that, and then turn around to a place that hasn't had as much love, that would be tremendous.
Wonderful. Kevin, that's a great place to end. Could you hold the book up one more time so people could see it?
Here it is.
Devil's Hole Pupfish. Beautiful. Folks, please just take a minute, read a little bit about this, buy this book, buy one for your friends. It is the kind of story that the more you keep digging, the more charming it becomes, the more interesting it becomes, the more beautiful it becomes, the more mysterious it becomes. It is truly a story that just keeps on giving. And it's a story that's happening right now, and it's an important story for our planet and for humans, and frankly, for the Devil's Hole pupfish. So, Kevin, thank you for writing this book. Congratulations on it, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Mark. It's great. This is really fun. Thank you.
Great. All right, folks. We will see you next week on The Thoughtful Bro with Colonel Alexander Vidman to talk about his role in the first Trump impeachment. We will see you then. Bye-bye.